Hi guys, I'm Sentin7 for headsupsng.com and this is my first video, Hunting Fish Like a Boss. So I recently watched a video by You Can't Spell. It's part of the Masters video series also on headsupsng.com. So yeah, if you haven't checked it out, definitely do so. It's a really good introduction to barreling and what You Can't Spell calls his fish frying techniques, or I guess his techniques for beating fish. And I was watching it while I was slumped in a bit of FPS, which for those who don't know, fancy play syndrome. So as my skills were improving in the game, I started taking more and more risks and making more and more unstandard plays, taking unstandard lines. And I think it got me into a lot of trouble sometimes. I think I was out leveling myself. And so after watching the video, I really kind of recalibrated myself and really focused on what makes money, especially in these days of Sharky Strata, where it's quite rare for, not rare, but not very common for regs to battle each other very often. It's mostly guys just playing randoms, playing fish, or playing regular recreational players who, although they play a lot, are not what we call thinking players. And I think that's really where most of our money is going to come in these games. Definitely until we get up to higher limits, but all the way from hundreds, most of the time definitely the 60s. The fish are very predictable, very standard, and a lot of them play relatively similar to each other. So that makes our job quite easy and lets us focus in on really important aspects of our strategy for making the most EV plays against them. But before we can look at any specific strategies or hand histories, there are a number of things that are important for us to consider. The first of these is that it's crucial for us to remember that this video strategy is intended almost exclusively for games against fish and randoms. Although there's obviously going to be some points that will cross over and definitely help your reg game and your thought process, the majority of the population tendency assumptions that we're going to look at on the next screen, they're not necessarily going to be applicable to good thinking regs who have a much greater variety in their play and are much less predictable, obviously. Next point I want to make is in regards to our NSD winnings, which are our non-showdown winnings. So quickly, for those who don't know, our non-showdown winnings are any chips that we win without having to show our cards. So for simple example, we raise our button, take down the pot with a C-bet. Those chips are added to our non-showdown winnings. Personally, I think that having a strong non-showdown line is probably one of the most critical aspects of being a successful reg. Some might argue with me, and that's fine, but the majority of non-showdown lines that I've seen from other solid regs have been extremely strong. And even for those that aren't, we could usually find the likely reason for it pretty quickly upon reviewing some hand histories, as it usually stands out quite heavily if you're doing something to negatively impact your non-showdown line. So I guess the question is, how do we get a sick non-showdown line that we can write home about? Well, we're going to discuss that a little bit more depth during our hand analysis, but the short answer is that we need to barrel and barrel often. And finally, before we get to the specifics, I think one great way to approach your game against fish, and something that I like to think of whenever I'm feeling out of the zone, is to think about the line versus the crocodile. So in a fight, although physically inferior to the line on a bunch of different levels, the croc's rated advantage is going to be the fact that all it really has to do is grab the line and drag it into the water beneath the surface. I mean, after all, it's going to be pretty difficult for the line to inflict any damage while it's using all its energy just trying to breathe. So much like the croc, all we really need to do is to become comfortable with our game, stay patient and aware enough to strike the moment the opportunity shows up. If we can do that and basically metaphorically drag our opponent beneath the surface or take them out of their comfort zone, whatever that is for your specific opponent, I think that's going to make us nearly unbeatable to them over the long run. Alright, so let's get down to business and start with our population tendencies, fish edition. So population tendencies, or PTs, refers to situations where we effectively paint all fish with the same brush and assign them certain characteristics without knowing them to be 100% true yet. Of course, each of these tendencies may in fact be the exact opposite of what a certain opponent might do, but in the absence of any more concrete information, I guess, these are going to be our best starting point as we begin to employ our game plan. And actually, that reminds me of an incredibly important aspect of our population tendency strategy, which is that we must adapt quickly. Basically, as soon as we see our opponent taking a line that is contradictory to any of our PT beliefs, we need to, I wouldn't say exactly throw them out completely, but definitely take careful notice and approach any similar hands cautiously while we try to develop more accurate reads on that specific situation. So let's take a look at what I believe some of these tendencies are. So first one, fish rarely flatten ace pre-flop, especially below 20 big blinds. Now, of course, this is a tendency that is not just strictly for fish. Many regs that you will play will have this exact same tendency, and in most situations it's in fact the correct strategy to put in any ace 20 big blinds with all things considered. But this is especially important for us when playing fish post-flop. Anytime there's an ace on the flop and they had just called a raise, it's going to be profitable for us to barrel a high percentage of the time. So it's important to keep that in mind. Number two, fish generally do not flat top pair post-flop, especially when it's susceptible. So if you have a fish, if we have a board like a 9-6-2, it's highly unlikely or quite uncommon for fish to flat their 9x, especially their very weak 9x, like their 9-8s, 9-7s. Most fish just don't want to get into the uncomfortable situations of seeing an overcard on turn and facing multiple streets of aggression. And so in order to counteract that and kind of avoid the situation altogether, they'll generally either check raise really big or they'll just simply check shove, not knowing what else to do. And of course, again, this is kind of dependent fish by fish. There are plenty of fish who will do the opposite of this, but again, we're just talking about population tendency, what we're going to see the most often when faced these situations. Next, which is a little bit of a continuation, same sort of idea, is that fish generally do not underbet or slow play wet boards. If they have it, they'll let you know quickly. So again, if they're in position on a board like a Queen 10-7 with two spades, they're not going to under c-bet. And when under c-bet, I mean if the pot is 120, they're not going to make it 40. They'll generally, for value, they're not going to play their Queen X's or any kind of value hand slowly. They'll generally bet half all the way to a full pot bet because, again, just like last situation, they don't want to face uncomfortable situations where bad cards or perceived bad cards appear and they are not sure what to do. So anytime they underbet or kind of check back and show any kind of weakness, we can take that as a pretty clear sign that we should proceed with aggression. Next, in position, fish will often get induced on brick rivers. So if you have kind of one of the most frequent and standard fishy lines is a fish in position will raise pre-flop, then c-bet, check back the turn, and then bet again on the river. I think on those kinds of situations and with certain types of boards that we'll discuss, I think it's very important for us to check both our value and our kind of weak showdown bluff catcher hands, because this will often induce the fish to spaz out in a situation where it's hard for them to have much value. And the flip side of that is, out of position, many fish will donk bet obvious rivers that complete their hand. So we'll look at a situation later, but anytime there's a hand that they'd expect you to check back your showdown value or get worried about the cards they could have caught or the hand they could have caught, they'll generally just quickly donk shove their hand and try to get you the hero call. So we'll look at that more in detail in a bit. And finally, most importantly, most fish are not thinking about your range. Now, this is something I struggle with sometimes with the aforementioned fancy play syndrome. I think to myself, well, a fish or my opponent must know that I wouldn't do this certain act in this situation, when in reality they're just looking at their cards, looking at the cards on board, and just making their decisions accordingly without too much further thought. So it's important that we don't level ourselves and kind of try and do too much. So that's it for our fish tendencies, and let's begin and look at some of our hand histories and try and put all this together. So we'll start it off with a couple of nice and easy, I guess what you'd call standard situations, but just review them quick to make sure we have it all covered. So pretty standard open, second hand in the match, I believe. The ace is a great card for our range, our perceived range. His range, since we don't believe he's going to flat too many aces, is now composed of air draws and then either sevens or eights. When he calls, that kind of range I think is confirmed. I think our range still looks quite strong. His looks a little bit weak, so picked up some added equity with the wheel draw, which isn't, it's important but not really crucial to our situation. So we're going to continue barreling, hope for a good river card, which is any card above second pair, so any card above an 8, especially ones that don't complete any kind of draws. He calls, our range for him is still pretty much the same as it was at the beginning of the hand. The queen, the offsuit queen is a perfect card for us. I think it's unlikely for him to have a queen, unlikely for him to have an ace, and so his only value hands here that could call any kind of bet are going to be sevens or eights, or some weird two pair, although with two pair like a pair of 7 8s, I think he's going to, at the latest, he's going to check raise on turn and let us know about that if he doesn't even do it on the flop. So I think when the queen comes, this is a perfect card for us to barrel. I think we set it up so we have pretty much a pot-sized shove left, which is a nice amount to put max pressure. And I think if he has an 8 or a 7 here, which is the likely he's kind of capped with that range or to that range, I think it's going to be very difficult for him to hero call. And if he does, well played, nice hand, and hopefully we get a rematch. So next we have King 3 offsuit. So we open here, pretty standard open. I think with second pair here, I think it would be a mistake to check. We most of the time we're gonna, well, high percentage of the time we're gonna have the best hand. So I think we're definitely betting for value as well as some protection, since of course our pair is so low. When he calls, we kind of look back at our fish tendencies of not check calling top pair, although this is one of the safest boards for him to do it on. I just still don't think it just happens very often. So in the absence of any proof that he is that type of player, I'm just going to assume he's not and act accordingly. So when the 8 comes, pretty safe card for us, a good card for us, and we can continue barreling. Bet half pot, kind of charge his draws. I think maybe you can bet even a little more if you wanted to. You could bet 90 to 100, but I think 80 is fine. When the queen comes, his most likely range is a 3, a 2, a lot of busted draws. There might be some kind of queens in his floats, but pretty unlikely. And pretty unlikely he paired the queen with the deuce or the 3 either. So when he checks to us, I think this is an interesting spot where having reviewed his range, he really can't have very much value. And so we think that we're either going to have to get a hero call from him to a shove, which is definitely one option, or if you don't think he's that kind of villain, if you think he's a little bit on the tighter side, I think here you can actually go for kind of this weird, small, thin, well, it's not thin value, but it's purely value, but kind of a smaller bet to induce him to either check shove his missed draws or just hero call something stupid. So I think the amount is debatable, but I think anywhere from 80 to 110, I think that's going to get us a lot more hero calls and weird spazzes than if we just shove. So although we might lose a tiny bit of value, if he has like a weaker 3 or something like that, I don't think there's very much in his range that can call a giant bet. So we just make a little call or a little bet and we have him call. People are going to argue maybe he would have called that to a shove. I guess that's debatable. I guess that's just a difference of opinion and your own opinions on how the fish is going to react to your actions. Next hand we have Jack 7 suited. Raise, obviously pretty standard. Now here is a situation where we pick up a flush draw, and what I like to do in these situations against fish, and again, remember this is strictly against fish, because if you're this obvious with regs, they're going to pick up on it really quickly, but against fish who you're probably only playing a couple times, I definitely think we can do some slightly more creative or exploitable moves. So one of those I think is underbetting here. I like to underbet 30 or 32 or 35, whatever you want to do. I think that leads to fish spazzing out. I think they get induced to check raising anything from just total air to worse draws that we might have dominated, kind of baby pairs, all that sort of thing. I think they thinking of it from a very basic first level fish kind of thinking, putting yourself back in their shoes. The days when you began, I think, seeing a small bet here, you think, oh well, if he had any kind of strong hand, he'd bet bigger to protect it. So I think that leads to a lot of fish getting induced. So we make a small bet. Ace is a great card for our perceived range and terrible for his. I think his range is made up of 8 flush draws, straight draws, maybe some 4s, and then just kind of weird draws like 7-6 or 10-jack, something random that they sometimes just float. So on the turn, I'd like to bet a little bit bigger, again, putting myself in a fishy mindset. I think that they would see this bet as, oh, look, he made a small bet on the flop when he didn't have it, and now he hit the ace, so he's trying to protect it. So I think we can make a slightly bigger bet and kind of represent that, confirm that thinking for him, or help him look at it that way. When he calls, again, his range is extremely capped, in my opinion, to probably a pair of 8s is about as high as his range goes. And against that range, I'm willing to, of course, with the 2 overcards and all the draw possibilities that he has, all the small pairs, I think it would be a giant mistake not to shove this here. And again, we've left ourselves just about a pot-sized bet. And there we go, we get a fold. Next, we have Jack Deuce suited on the button, make a standard open, pick up a pretty monster flop with our hand. And on this type of board, I'm really don't mind getting it in. And my thought process is if I don't mind getting it in here, then I'd almost like to induce. I think my range plays very strong against his. Because I think in a situation here, if we induce, we induce a lot of check raises from worse draws that we could have in bad shapes with the worst flush draws. And even against hands like 2-pair 8s and 7s or anything like that, I think we're doing pretty good. We're still in pretty good shape, pretty much no matter what his hand combination is here. So that might be a debatable strategy, but it's been working out, so I'll just keep attempting to find good spots for it and see how it goes. So instead we underbet here and kind of attempt to induce a little bit. He doesn't oblige, he just flats. On the turn, again, the ace is a great card for our perceived range, for the same reasons we talked about before. Here I like, because stacks are a little bit shorter, you'll notice I like to make this just a half pot bet as opposed to a little bit bigger like we did in the previous hand. And I think this kind of retains the maximum fold equity we get on a river shove while still maintaining the image of trying to protect a hand, which you might think we are doing now. So make it just a half pot size bet. Leave us kind of a small river shove, but I think on the right cards, which there are tons of, basically anything above an 8, as well as obviously the flush draw or a deuce, I think are great cards for us. The offsuit queen, just like in the first example, is a great card for our range. And just thinking again about his range, it's almost impossible for him to have any kind of value here. It's pretty strongly capped to pair of 8s, I'd say, or maybe a backdoored queen with certain draws. I think we might be bluffing bluffing the best hand here by betting, but I think checking back is still, I don't think there's that much value in it, as he's going to fold all worse draws, and we actually get quite a bit of fold equity versus a lot of hands that we're losing to. So not a lot, but there's a fair amount of hands that we're still losing to. You might even fold a queen at this point, although unlikely. Probably very unlikely, but regardless, I think it's a good spot for our range to shove and make him hero call. and we do so, and he folds. So next we have 10-6 suited. I think this is a hand where I made a small mistake. Well, I don't think it's that small. I think it's a pretty significant mistake pre-flop. This is our villain's first button, and he open limps, which I think is an indicator in itself that he might be a little bit of a fishy player or a passive player. So I think against that type of opponent, 10-6 is definitely good enough to open here and start putting some pressure on him. But I went ahead and checked, so that was a mistake on my part. I run pretty good and we flop top pair anyways. I think in this situation, I think betting top pair is best, because if we kind of start thinking about extrapolating, sorry, lost the word for a second, extrapolating his previous actions, which is limping his first button pre-flop, I think we can deduce that he might be a bit more of a passive player, since that's all the information we have to go on. And so we don't really want him to check back here too much, and I think we both get a calls from a lot of floats, draws, worse hands, and we might actually induce him to do something crazy with either overs or just stick in his draws, which obviously is not going to be the worst play for him. But he goes ahead and calls, and when he does that, I think his range, as before, is pretty capped. I don't think he ever has a 10 here. I don't think he ever has anything like a set or really any kind of value hand. So I'm putting him on a lot of flush draws, straight draws, weak pairs, and just floats. I think the queen here on turn is a decent card for his range, but I think it's going to be one where he's going to let us know really quickly if it hit him. I don't think if he did hit that queen and we bet into him, he's going to do anything but raise or shove. I don't think he's going to slow play such a wet board. So I think we can continue to barrel and be pretty safe in knowing that he'll make it pretty obvious to us if he has the speed at this point. When he flats, I'm very confident that our hand is good, and I'm just planning to make a river value bet on any good card. And actually this card came and it changed the dynamic a little bit, because it was the perfect barrel card for him. As we spoke about in the tendencies, fish like to bluff brick rivers, which he will see this as a brick river, having missed a flush and any kind of other draws, as well as just being a general scare card. I will give him credit that when he shoves here, this is a shove that a lot of fish will make with their value hand, such as specifically the 5. I think when they hit a hand like that, they generally get very excited and just try and go for a max value. So obviously I don't think the villain is thinking in those kinds of terms, but it is his range definitely becomes very polarized to kind of like the nut hand, which in this case is a 5 or total error draw. And again, versus the entirety of his range with all those draws and all that air, I think just the pair of 5s, I think it's worthwhile for us to call and take our chances. So he overshoves, and I pretty much snapped it off. And as we suspected, it was a draw. I was extremely surprised to see how big his draw was. I would have thought he would have raised at some point. Even fish, when they pick up flush draw and open enders, I think are generally think, oh well, that's good enough, let's get it in. But the fact that he didn't shows that how passive fish can really play even at these levels, that with such a monster, he could have raised on the flop, the turn, done a lot of things, but he just chose to just call it down and then bluff it off when we showed a little bit of weakness. Next, we have just a quick and easy example of one of the tendencies we spoke about earlier, which is that fish don't underbet wet boards. So fish opens here, and we flat with 7-9 suited. Some people might choose to non-all-in 3-bet here. I don't, so just went ahead and flatted. And actually in this hand, with this flop, I just had basically kind of decided to fold already. I had my hand over the fold button and everything. And then villain went ahead and min bet this, and right away the alarm bells went off in my head, and started thinking about his range and how it's extremely unlikely to be composed of any kind of value range. I don't think he ever does this with a jack or better. So if we hold that to be true, then his range is composed of a lot of weak pairs, draws, and total air. And against a range that appears that weak, I'm willing to fight to make my range appear much stronger. I don't think it's very difficult to do that. So when I see the min bet, I decide to go ahead, make a little bit bigger of a check raise than we would sometimes make. And I think that's just for kind of perception of what he's going to look at it as in his kind of first level thinking, where big bet means big hand. And if he has total hit air here, which I think he does a huge percentage of the time, it's going to be very difficult for him to fight back against this. So I went and 4x'd it with the intention of barreling off on a lot of boards. But he went ahead and folded. So we take that node, and that's a very handy one to have. So that's just a quick and easy one. Here we have 5-7 off, open on the button. Fish calls the 8-7-9 mono board. I think is a pretty good for both our hand and our range, since we don't think he has very many aces in this range. When we c-bet and he calls, I think his range is composed of single pairs like the 7s or 9s, all the standard draws we could imagine here, one card of flush draws, kind of straight draws, all this sort of stuff. I think the turn sometimes might connect him to some kind of 7-6 2 pair, maybe even a 9-6 2 pair. But I think we got to maintain the perception of strength in our range. So I think since we would be barreling our ace here, kind of any of our value hands, I think we got to continue to barrel, and it'll set us up for a possible river bet. So again, make it kind of half pot. Villain goes ahead and calls. Enough pretty squarely put him on kind of flush draws, 2 pairs possibly, but more likely than not pair and kind of weak draw or something of that sort, fairly weak range. Now on this river, this is an interesting river because it leads to our population tendency that fish will donk shove kind of obvious boards that might have made their hand. So in the case that he somehow has an 8 here, or that he somehow flopped the flush and was slow playing, I think on a four straight board like this with a flush draw and everything, I think with any kind of value hands, the fish get worried that we're going to check back, and so they decide to just jam it in and pray we have an ace, or can hero call them with some kind of 2 pair or something like that. So although I think we do have some showdown value here, I think there's more to gain by turning our hand kind of into a bluff and shoving here, keeping our range really strong. And to our villain, we expect him to kind of see that card in frustration. So even if he had a hand like a 7-6, he might now just think, well, so much has gotten there, and there's so many different possibilities for him to have a hand that beats me. It's not that we expect to get folds from 2 pairs very often, but I think there's a possibility, and definitely 1 pairs. And again, we could be bluffing with the best hand, but I think that it's worth the risk, which if we're bluffing with the best hand, there is no risk. So I think jamming here is a superior play, and we bluffed ourselves again, basically a pot size bet left. So like I said, I think checking back there can be a significant mistake against a lot of opponents, so I'd much prefer to see a shove there. So for these last 2 hands here, we're going to cover a topic that's really important when playing fish, and that's getting max value and not kind of checking back rivers unnecessarily. So here we start with an actual premium hand. We're a little bit shorter stacked. This is obviously a great flop for us, so we don't expect him to have much of anything that can beat us here, except for possibly a 9-8 or some kind of like aces, slow played aces pre-flop, something like that, but unlikely, as generally fish don't really trap that much with aces or kind of their top pocket pairs, although of course you do see it some of the time, so make note when you do. But in this case, again, I'm going to make him prove to me that he can do it. So betting for value, of course, you might even be able to bet a little bit bigger here. I just wanted to kind of remain look semi-weak, just seem like a standard C bet. The ace is both good and bad. Of course, it's unlikely to hit him, but it might scare him. So I think some of the time we get folds here that we don't want. I still don't think there's obviously any value to checking back here. We don't want to give him any free equity. Well, it's not that there's no value. I think you might be able to make a case here for trapping if you don't think you get 3 streaks of value. But I went ahead and decided to fire. It makes our river bet, which right now as it stands is going to be for value. Makes it more likely to be called because our stacks are getting pretty shallow in comparison to the pot. So when he goes ahead and calls, I think his hand is composed of, since we think he would have checked raised 9, is composed of a lot of weak pairs and a lot of draws like 10-jack, 7-5, 7-6 sort of hands. So against all those, of course, we're betting for value. Now the 9 comes, and this is a spot where I see people possibly get worried and check back, and I think that's, I don't think there's very much merit to that. I think the 9 would have shown up earlier on the flop if we think he hit that. I think he would have let us know. Most of the time, of course, we're still just talking about general tendencies. So if we don't think he has a 9, we don't think he has an ace, that means we're pretty much have the nut hand here. So I think checking back is a pretty big mistake. I think we can bet either small if you want it to be super fancy, or just shove here and hope to get hero called by an ace, a deuce, or some kind of ridiculous king high. Or you see a lot of weird things in these situations. So I went ahead and made sure to get max value and jam, and we get called by queen 8. This is kind of exactly where we thought we were in the hand. And finally, queen 7, another situation where it's important for us to get max value, again a little bit shorter. We open here, villain flats, we flop top pair, so with this stack, obviously this is effectively the nuts to us. We go ahead, and this is, as we talked about before, I kind of thought with the shorter stacks, this might induce from a huge range of hands, from pair of 10s to flush draws, even a pair of deuces, straight draws, kind of basically the entire range I think gets induced here a lot of the time. So I think underbet, especially considering it's not going to be hard for us to get our stack in with our stack size. So underbet and hope he spazzes a little bit, which he doesn't. 9 is a fair card to hit his range. With kind of like 9 jacks, 9 8s sort of hands, possibly inside some flush draws, king 9. But I don't think, of course, yes, you could have 10-9 as well. But again, I think we're effectively betting the nuts here, so we can continue to barrel, bet it a little bigger again to make our river shove. If we get a nice brick river, I think we get called a lot more, here called a lot more often in that situation. Again, once he calls, I think even a hand like the nut hand here, jacking, I think lets us know and just check raises here with both flush draws present on the board. I think Fish will just get it in and be happy to take down the pot if under the worst case scenario there. But so when he calls, his range again still weighted towards all those hands, with kind of the 10 being the top of it. The 3, so this is the situation again where I see some people getting scared. Maybe the fish just chased the flush draw down and now I'm beat, or maybe he has a better queen. But under the population tendency that we talked about, where we think fish are going to donk bet their obvious made hands, or what they perceive as obvious, which flush draw is definitely one of those. I think he, with the flush, high majority of the time, or high percentage of the time, he's going to donk shove. So when he doesn't do that, I'm again really confident in the strength of my hand, and don't let the little bit of fear inside your head get you, and just make the proper play, which I personally believe is just shoving here and hoping to get heroed. And that's what happened, and his range is pretty much what we expected it to be. Or sorry, his hand is pretty much within the range that we expected it to be.